get started. I expect folks will keep trickling in, but want to be mindful of everybody's time. So just a few housekeeping things. Please try to keep your video on. I understand if you do need to turn it off. Please mute your audio if you're not speaking, and introduce yourself, ask questions in the chat. We'll be utilizing the chat box a lot. So as I'm speaking or sharing information, feel free to just put your questions in the chat box. If I don't get through to your question during the presentation, I'll be going through and answering all of them at the end. You are going to get the slide deck and a link of the recording for this webinar via email within 2 business days. So give us a second, but you'll have all of this to share with your colleagues and others in your network in a couple of days. And please, introduce yourself in the chat box. And I am gonna get us going. So the topic for today's webinar is community project funding, also known as earmarks. So it is the return of earmarks to Congress. And there is $1.4 trillion in discretionary spending on the table annually now as a result of community project funding coming back. So if you're not familiar with the National Network for Youth, we are on a mission to transform systems so that no young person in America experiences homelessness. And we do this through our National Youth Advisory Council, public education and policy advocacy, and we provide training and technical assistance through webinars like this, but also directly to communities through our local cross-system collaboratives on youth homelessness. And we are a member network. We do represent over 300 community-based youth serving organizations across the country. So we invite all of you, if you're not a member, to become a member. Join our network. Together, we really can create systemic change to prevent and end youth homelessness. So this is what we're going to cover today. So first is, what is new about earmarks? Some of you may have been familiar with what earmarks were like in the previous iteration. So I'm going to share, what is new, what are some of the requirements, process, what can be funded. Then we're going to talk about our recommendations on what we think you should do, what you can do to get your proposals before your representative, and then just some tips. I've been having conversations with folks on the Hill, trying to get intel information, behind the scenes perspective. Sorry. Sorry. 1 second. And we're back. All right, one of those mom moments. Okay, that was Ellie. She says hi, I'm sure. Okay, so let's dig in. So earmarks are back. Whether you knew about earmarks before or not, they are back, but to be clear, they are only back in the House of Representatives. They are not yet back in the Senate. But the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which is Senator Leahy from Vermont, he has made a public statement that there is an intent in the Senate to bring back earmarks, but that hasn't happened yet. So people have been asking, what are earmarks? Why did they go away? These are all good questions. So earmarks were banned in 2011 amid, concerns from both sides of the aisle that it was wasteful pork spending, right? There were bribery scandals. There was also the famous bridge to nowhere in Alaska. All of those were kind of elevated to the public conscious, and earmarks were given a really negative reputation. And then there was, the rise of the Tea Party, fiscal conservative, we need to spend less money, federal government should be spending less money. Thank you for loving my children. And earmarks went away. You know, folks who are, you know, supportive of earmarks would have different arguments, but the spending accounted for 1% of federal spending, and earmarks went away, but the federal budget didn't decrease by 1%. So there was actually no cost saving when you're looking at total federal budget spent when earmarks went away. So that's a little bit of the history, and a little bit about why they're back, right? Like, here we go. So what's new, right? So either this is what's new or what they are, just depending on how familiar you were with the old version of earmarks. So what we have is increased transparency. And again, this only applies to folks in the House, your House of Representatives. So House representatives are required to post every request online simultaneously with their submission, and they can only submit 10. But whatever 10 requests or however many requests they choose to make has to be posted publicly. The Appropriations Committee, so the full committee, is going to publicly release the list of all projects funded publicly at least 48 hours before the full committee votes. So every member of Congress gets to submit up to 10 requests for community project funding. And if those advance, meaning they fit within the rules of the committee, and then there has to be a full vote by the Appropriations Committee on those requests, that full list of community funding projects that is going to be voted on by the full Appropriations Committee has to be made public at least 48 hours before a vote takes place. So this is all new. Also, members have to certify, so your House representative has to certify that their spouse or immediate family has no financial interest in any of the projects that they personally are requesting. And that when reporting legislation containing community project funding, a committee must identify each item in a committee report and joint explanatory statement and make it publicly available online. Again, these are all just kind of maybe nerdy things around making it public, but also making sure that, you know, there's no member of Congress that's going to be getting, you know, any type of kickback, right? And like a lot of public disclosure around that. The second thing that's different about the new earmarks is that you have to demonstrate community support. That was not the case in the past. So every member of Congress has to provide evidence that there is support in the community, that there are compelling factors that influence their decision to select this project, to move it forward, right? Because again, every member of Congress only gets to put forward 10 projects, right? Which is also different than the previous versions of earmarks. Also, for-profits are absolutely not eligible as a primary to get any of the new earmark money. So to be eligible, then you have to be a state or local government or an eligible nonprofit that's requesting support. It doesn't mean you can't contract or subcontract with a for-profit if they're going to provide a service that helps you, you know, fulfill your community project, but they can't be the primary. Also new, all requests have to be in writing. And every subcommittee has a little bit of a different application, for lack of a better word. It's kind of like an application, but there has to be a written request. So every member of Congress has to comply with the subcommittee that has jurisdiction over that request. They have to comply with the application, written materials that particular subcommittee is required. And I'll get more into this later. And I'll get more later into like what that looks like. But, and some other things just to know is, you know, there's an overall cap on like how much money, how much of the federal budget can go to community project funding. And so that's 1% of discretionary spending, which is approximately $1.4 trillion. That's a lot of money on the table. And we want to make sure that you all get some of that money for your communities. Also new is that, you know, there's enhanced auditing. So I don't know if people are familiar with the GAO, but it's the Government Accountability Office. They are going to be doing an audit of a sample of community project funding, and they're going to be reporting findings to Congress. So there's just a little added layer of accountability where it's not, you know, legislators monitoring legislators. There's an outside independent government agency that's going to be doing an audit as well. All right, so a little bit more about the rules. So members of Congress, and again, this is in the House, they have to comply with rules as it relates to requesting community project funding. So, and like I said, every appropriations subcommittee has slightly different rules. So what I'm about to share is general, but know that it will vary based on the subcommittee that has jurisdiction over the project that you're proposing. And I am going to be talking about, you know, what I think are probably the most likely subcommittees and buckets that you all could go after funding for. So there's a 10 request limit. Every member can submit up to 10, no more than 10, but they don't have to submit 10. And, you know, I don't think every House representative is going to submit any, right? There are some members of Congress, you know, mainly independents or, you know, members of the Republican Party who are opposed to earmarks, community project funding. And I think, you know, constituents are probably reaching out, wanting them to submit a community project funding request on their behalf, but they won't, just because they don't agree with that. As a policy, we are going to strongly encourage you to reach out and to find out if that's the case and to have the conversation. But just know that this isn't compulsory. Like every member of Congress is not required to submit 10, you know, so so just to flag that. Also, it's not multi-year funding. You can't request funding for multiple fiscal years. The funding would be just for FY 2022. And you have to include an explanation of the request. So, and that explanation really should, you know, kind of explain, why is this a good use of taxpayer dollars? Why should the federal government put their money towards this work in this community, right? So, and this information, I think for the most part is going to have to be, it's all going to be public, right? So whatever you put in writing is going to be public for anybody who can access the internet to see. And the community project funding requests are also require, you know, all of the same elements of any funding request, right? And remember that anything you submit will become public if your representative chooses to advance your request, if you make the one of the 10. So some of the things, you know, you're going to be required to include is a project description. Some are very short, you know, it's 1,000 characters, project description, right? You have to include a budget with a budget explanation. You need to break down everything. So, you know, all of the same things that you need to submit with other requests, you know, and specifically in some of the rules that I have read for the subcommittees, you have to include salaries, tuition payments, education materials, supplies, exhibits, travel, everything has to be detailed. And then you have to provide the demonstrated community support. You definitely cannot expect your congressional representative to go out and find, you know, the community support, right? So you need to think about, are there multiple partners, right, in your community who are going to be jointly administering the project? That's a way of demonstrating community support, that it's not just one organization, right? Can you get letters of support, right, from others in your community, other nonprofits, government, education agencies, or, local government, right? That will go a long way. And please remember, you really need to work, and I'm going to get into that later. You have to work with your specific member of Congress and know exactly what you're requesting and know exactly what you're required to provide. Are they wanting financial statements, right? Are they wanting audits? They'll probably want your official, proof of your nonprofit status. If you are, if it's a regional project, which, has some strengths to it, but if it's a regional project that would cover multiple congressional districts, right? And you're speaking to, for example, say 3 different representatives' offices in your state that cover your community, you really need to tell the other representatives that, so just so you're being transparent. Okay. So moving on, the $1 million question, or should I say $1 trillion question, is what exactly can the community project funding fund? Please know it is limited. It is not anything under the sun. The House of Representatives has very specific rules, which I recommend you look at yourself directly. We have the link here on our website. We have, I did a very detailed summary with hyperlinks to exactly the different rules in the subcommittees. So this hyperlink is here. So it has very detailed rules. So I'm going to go through the rules that I think most easily fit with the work that you all are doing. And also know, this webinar was a quick turnaround from our summit. Yeah, I can put the link in the chat. Thanks. Okay, here. And just know, this is a quick turnaround from our summit ending to pulling this webinar off, because look at these deadlines. And so to be clear, and we have a graphic later, these deadlines are when the member of Congress has to submit their request to the appropriate subcommittee, right? So that's why it's like, finish this webinar and call your House representative. I mean, not to be too extreme, but the deadline for Labor HHS is April 28th, and for THUD is April 30th. And every subcommittee has a little bit of a different, but it's either the 28th, the 29th, or the 30th, depending on the subcommittee. And every subcommittee has allowable spending. I'm just focusing on these 2 subcommittees, but know that this link that I put in the chat, you can delete the Google stuff in front and just look at the but it will show every subcommittee. And then these are the links for each of the subcommittees, but you can get to that from the other ones. So let's dive in. So first is the Department of Labor. I know many of you provide employment support to young people in your community. So the Department of Labor, again, it's pretty narrow. So under the Employment and Training Administration, you can submit, and this is the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act demonstration program, is the only Labor Department program that supports community project funding. And community project funding has to be designated under the Training and Employment Services. So all projects must meet all statutory mandated requirements, except if you're exempt from the requirement to compete, right? So this isn't a competition, but every other mandates in WIOA and in the Employment and Training Services program still applies. And in addition to all of that, all projects must, so all community project funding must include direct service to individuals in order to enhance employment opportunities. All projects must demonstrate evidence of a linkage with the state or local workforce investment system. I'm assuming many of you are, and there must be an evaluation component. So a way to evaluate the program. Equipment purchases can be included, may be included within your community project funding request, only if it's incidental to the entire project, right? And a similar standard applies to curriculum development, which should be incidental to the project's emphasis on direct service. So the project, bottom line, has to be emphasized on providing direct services to individuals, and any other costs like equipment or curriculum development needs to be incidental to the direct services. Community project funding cannot be used for construction or renovation of facilities, and there's no exceptions there. Okay, so let's move on to the Department of Health and Human Services. So the bucket that's allowable at HHS is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So community project funding within SAMHSA should be submitted through the Health Surveillance and Program Support account, and community project funding must fall under one of the following categories. So this isn't an all, it's a one. You can just pick one. So the first one is mental health. Grants have to support programs that promote the prevention or treatment of mental health disorders, including rehabilitation, outreach, and other supportive services. The second one is substance abuse treatment. So these grants would be to support programs that improve access, reduce the barriers, and promote high quality, effective treatment and recovery services. And then the third bucket is substance abuse prevention. So these are grants that would support programs to prevent the onset of illegal drug use, prescription drug misuse and abuse, alcohol abuse, and alcohol misuse and abuse, and underage alcohol and tobacco use. Community project funding cannot be used for construction other than, so this has a little exception, unlike the other one, other than a limited amount of renovation necessary to carry out a funded project. So the bulk of the money cannot go to any type of renovation. If, you know, I guess an argument could be made, you need to, you know, I don't know, do some type of renovation in order to provide these services directly to clients. You could include a little bit of money for that in a budget. All right, now we're going to move on to the Department of Education. All right, so specific to elementary and secondary education, community project funding includes instructional services, after-school centers, curricula development, teacher training, acquisition of books and computers, arts education, social and emotional learning activities, full service community schools, and early childhood education. In general, the focus of elementary and secondary education community project funding should be providing early childhood or K through 12 educational services. This is, you know, if you're noticing, this is a bit broader than what we have with the Department of Labor or what we have with the Department of Health and Human Services. Sorry, here we go. So community project funding should, community project funding projects under the elementary and secondary education are also eligible. So improving special education services, early intervention services for infants and toddlers, transition services, post-secondary education services, and the eligible grantees, and this is like verbatim, is state education agencies, school districts, colleges and universities, and other public and private nonprofit entities. So generally, community project funding intended for individual schools is provided to the applicable school district and not directly to an individual school. So it's much more likely to go to or it's not going to go to an individual school. Like my elementary school, Curtin Elementary School, isn't going to get this. The school district would get this, or the state education agency. And they're very, I mean, they spell that out pretty clearly. All right, so this is what it cannot be used for, right? So within the buckets, we're still within the Department of Education. Community project funding cannot be used for construction or renovation of school buildings, except, this has an exception, in the case of minor remodeling required as part of technology upgrades. Now, we don't know what minor means. There's no percentage of budget, limitations specified in the rules at all. And daycare and child care projects that do not include educational services are not eligible. So if your daycare, child care project, and you include educational services, I think it's, it's worth a conversation. And again, we have the link here to look at the Labor HHS specific subcommittee webpage for all the details. All right, and don't forget to put your questions in the chat. So now I'm going to move on to a different subcommittee. So Health and Human Services and Education, they're within the same subcommittee of the bigger Appropriations Committee, which is the money committee. And we're going to move to the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee. And so within the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and there is actually, when you go to the website, there's 3 different links. You'll want to click on the HUD one, not the transportation one, or I forget what the other one is. So within HUD, there's the Economic Development Initiative. So again, community project funding may be used for economic and community development activities, including land or site acquisition, demolition, or rehabilitation of housing facilities, construction and capital improvements of public facilities like water, sewer. And again, remember that local and state governments can go after these as well, right? Requests may also include planning and other activities consistent with a community development block grants, and then the underlying authorization within HUD. So I know many of you are familiar with CDBG. Basically what's allowable to be funded under that, it seems to be giving an opening to get funding for CDBG activities. And again, I included the link there. This is the not part. So continuing on the Economic Development Initiative, community project funding requests are not eligible for reimbursements for expenses or activities that you already have been undertaken. So I read this as, if you've already started like a land acquisition or some type of housing project, you can't get reimbursed for expenses that you've already incurred or activities that you've already undertaken. Whether you can get money for future expenses of continuing that project, I think it's worth a conversation, right? And I'll get into that next. All projects must be supported broadly by local stakeholders, including residents, businesses, and elected officials. So this is the only subcommittee rules that I read that got a little bit specific about the community support that was required. None of the other ones did. It's just, you need to show community support, and they're not clear about that. But here, they're very clear that it's local stakeholders, including residents. I know a lot of you struggle, you know, a lot of providers on struggle with NIMBYism, right? Or so they want to make sure residents in the community are supported, businesses, and elected officials. So this is kind of giving you some marching orders in terms of what type of support that member of Congress is going to be required to provide, which means you and your partners, right? And all projects must be administered by government or nonprofit entities, including public housing agencies, tribes, and tribally designated housing entities. Again, this is, the subcommittee got a little clear on, you know, who's eligible to get this money. And again, a link to the guidance. So this is the process, and I've alluded to it a bit throughout the presentation. But the process is you or you and your, you know, your community partners, if you're doing a, you know, like a joint application, you need to talk to your US House representative or representatives if your project crosses multiple congressional districts. And then your member of Congress has to choose to advance your request to the House Appropriations Subcommittee, and then it'll go through the full committee, not to get too into the weeds. So this is the process. And so there's some thresholds. So now I'm going to get into, you know, kind of our recommendations, right? Based on conversations that we've been having with folks on the Hill to try to get as much insider information as we can for you all. This is what we recommend. One, look at your US representative's website. A lot of US House representatives have forms on their website, and they say, if you're, you know, for more information about community project fundings, and they kind of tell you what to do. But don't just fill out a form. Always pick up a call, always try to get a meeting. It's the same thing with any foundation, right? Like, you don't just want to submit a blind application. You want to at least try to have a conversation, you know, grease the wheels, all of that, right? So don't just fill out a form on a website and cross your fingers. Pick up the phone, make an email, you know, send an email, get a meeting. But you really want to look at, so I just went through at a high level, you know, what I think are the buckets that your work could most easily fit into. And there's not a whole lot more detail. There's not a lot of details more than what I just shared in any of the links that, you know, we've provided to you. So, but think through, you know, what are some projects that are, you know, if you had the money, you could implement it, you know, in a short time frame. And what projects seem most eligible within the buckets, right? And reach out to your US representative, get a meeting. And in that meeting, really get clear on what are the next steps. Do you think my project fits, right? Do you think it fits within the guidelines? And what we've been hearing is, you know, members of Congress have been having conversations with constituents, and then they've been going back and talking to, you know, the Appropriations Committee experts on community project funding. And there's a bit of a back and forth between the member's office and the Appropriations Committee staff to really see, you know, does this project seem to fit within the rules that the Appropriations Committee has released, right? So it's a bit of, you know, kind of a negotiation and a conversation that the member of Congress needs to have with the Appropriations Committee. So you're going to want to be direct, right? Like, does this project fit, you know, within the confines, within the rules of the committee that the committee has put forth, right? And ask them, what are the next steps? You know, are you going to get back to me with, you know, the specific information? that I need to provide? Are there deadlines? Because every office has their own internal deadline so that they can meet their deadline to the committee of the 28th, the 29th, or the 30th of this month, right? And you want to know, are you going to be one of the 10, right? So you kind of need to prepare to advocate, like why your project, why this community project is a great use of taxpayer funding, how, it's going to benefit their congressional district. So you really need to advocate so that your request, which is, you can guarantee that like local government, other folks, government and nonprofit folks are also trying to get some of this funding as well. So you need to advocate, and I'll talk more kind of our tips on that later. But this is what I recommend if you haven't already started. Oh, good question. I think most House members are likely to be participating with community project funding, unless I think if someone is a pretty vocal Tea Party member, maybe they're not participating. But I would still call and reach out, because some members of Congress are just not great about communications and putting things on their website. So if there's nothing on the website, I wouldn't give up. I would call and find out. That would be my recommendation. Okay, so these are our tips. Again, based on the conversations I've been having, getting all the intel that I can, these are tips for preparing strong projects. And hopefully this is all helpful to you. And please keep putting, your questions in the chat. So the latest incarnation of earmarks will favor projects from state and local governments and nonprofits. I don't think having a for-profit as a partner is going to strengthen your application. I think it might hurt it. And members of Congress are exploring, who are exploring earmarking and getting involved, are going to be eager to back projects. Yes, we're going to provide all the slides after the recording. They're going to be most eager to back projects or to put forth projects that have the strongest community support, right? So if I'm a member of Congress and I only get to put forth 10, and it's all going to be public, right? And, there's political ramifications. So I think you need to be aware of the politics. Then you as a representative would want to be seen as putting forth projects that have broad community support, right? And anything, any type of well-documented potential benefits to their district, to the community, projects that are ready to start, right? Like this is not planning grant money, right? Like this is not money to plan to do a thing. This is, you and whoever the implementers of this work are saying, we are the experts. We have, there's a need. We can meet that need. You don't want to seem like a risk or a gamble. You want to seem like, a strong, integral part of the community, meeting a great need with broad community support, right? But there is no perfect project. So I don't want you to think like, oh, I just need to find like the perfect project. No. Don't bang your head against the wall. I think you should think of it more as like an ongoing conversation, similar to like philanthropy, right? And foundations. And I really think you should look, take a hard look at your projects, right? And look at it. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? I'll get more into that in terms of like the politics and the partners. Okay, so then other tips. So some practicalities, we've heard that are important to consider. What is the timeline of your project? is this project ready to begin? And if not, what further steps are needed, right? So if your project wouldn't be ready to get started until 2023, then it's not going to be a strong proposal, we've heard. Are there documented public safety, health, or educational benefits to the project, right? Like, what are the positives in research, in data, whatever you have? Are there any trade-offs on investing in this project versus others in the region, right? So that's kind of what members of Congress are going to be weighing. Also, what are the economics? So how many or what kinds of jobs would this project create, and for how long? I think there's always an interest in kind of job creation. What's the regional economic benefit? And I think, again, like, is it short-term economic benefit or long-term? What's the estimated impact on the local tax base, right? Is the project located in a disadvantaged or underserved area, or will it support an underserved population? And I think those are positives, right? If they are. So some politics. I had alluded to this before, but you kind of always have to consider the politics. So how much non-federal entities such as state, local governments, private donors, or other funders contributing to the project? So again, similar to foundations, would this community project funding, money be the only funder, or do you already have, some other, other investors, if you will, right? Like other supporters? Do regional, local governments, business, and residents support the project? This again goes to community support. Are there other members of Congress who support the project, right? Because I think that helps, sometimes, well, not sometimes, but members of Congress are not necessarily brave. So they like to do things in groups, right? And so if there's a couple of members of Congress who have their name on something, it's a little less politically risky for them if it doesn't go well. I mean, I think at the end of the day, no member of Congress wants their name associated with bribery, any type of scandal, or certainly not funding a bridge to nowhere, right? And so that's not what any member of Congress wants to be their legacy to be. So I think the more you can just show your expertise, your ability, your competence, your trustworthiness, right, the better. And then, really to identify and develop a champion. I mean, beyond preparing a strong proposal, applicants are going to boost their bids for an earmark by securing, bipartisan, bicameral congressional champions who are willing to put their name on your proposal, right? And so that's why, it's not possible, for everybody to do or necessary, but if you are doing a larger regional project, then your pool of potential champions grows, right? Because then you can have, multiple House representatives who are kind of behind your proposal, right? Because it goes through all of their congressional districts. So tips for, final tip, prepare for the long haul. Earmarks and the appropriations process is a year-long cycle. So, it will likely require months of advocating and pushing to maximize your chances for success. So if you have, a strong local group of supporters for your project who are willing to advocate, then that will help. Here are some of our resources. We have a legislative lookup page. Maybe you don't know who your House representative is. We do have that on our website now. We have a resource center. we do have a post-webinar survey that we will ask you to complete, but I'm going to answer some of the questions that have been coming in. 15 minutes left. This is good. All right, so scrolling up. Yes, so you can submit the same project, which operates in different districts, to different members. And so my understanding, and it's not 100% clear, this is where like talking directly to, your representative's offices, but I think how it can work is you can have your proposal that has like 2, 3, 4, 5 representatives' names on it. So you are one of the 10 that 5 different representatives are putting forward, right? How that looks and like the details of what would get released publicly is unclear. But that's what it would look like. And so, and again, you would want to be transparent, right? You would want to meet with all of the representatives' districts who the project would impact, and say, hey, look, this is the project. I would like, Representative X, Representative Z, and Representative Y to all put forward this community project funding. Yeah, and I think, and the project doesn't have to be in a member's district. Like I haven't read that as a requirement. I think a member of Congress could put forward community project funding for anything that fits within the requirements. But I think representatives are more likely to put forward projects that would directly help constituents in their district, right? Because at the end of the day, every member of Congress wants to get reelected, right? So I think if you have a relationship with your representatives for every place that you have a base of operations, then I think it never hurts to ask, right? So even if that's not necessarily where the work will happen, maybe constituents from that district, are served there as well. I mean, there's a lot of mobility, right, among certain populations. I always err on the side of just ask. The worst they can say is no. And again, the type of, like what you want from your member of Congress is you want them to sponsor your application. You want it to be one of their 10. Like that's what you want. In terms of community support, I mean, I think if you have, for example, a Democratic House representative and, the mayor is also a Democrat of that district and is supportive of the project, and maybe that the mayor and the representative are close, then I would ask the mayor for a letter of support for your project, right? So, you kind of have to play politics in terms of the letters of support. I mean, I think all of the work that you do is a benefit. And so I don't think that's a hard argument to make at all. You're all serving, underserved communities. So, I think all of that is pretty straightforward. So the question is, are most funding opportunities not for capital requests? So it seems as if the capital request would really be within the HUD bucket, right? And the CDBG and, a lot of the infrastructure improvement, sewage, roads, that type of thing. I'm not an expert on CDBG, but there does seem to be quite a bit that could be done there around those types of projects. But when you're looking at, the education, the SAMHSA, the employment and training, capital projects are either like completely, well, they're not allowed. And in some depending on the program, there is some allowable limited renovation if necessary for, serving people directly. There's definitely an emphasis on direct services within the education, within the Department of Labor, and within the Health and Human Services buckets of rules that have been released. So there is no estimate on the amount per project. I think that's a conversation for, you to have with your member of Congress if they have, their own internal, like, my 10 projects are not going to cost more than X. And I think that's where their conversations with the Appropriations Committee is important, because total, all House representatives who are participating, their 10 requests, or however many they submit, can't be more than 1.4 trillion of a dollar amount. I would say ask for what you need, right, within the allowable spending structure. And then it's a negotiation, right? This is your elected official, you're a constituent, you vote in their next election, you make a strong case as you can, and just have a conversation. But I wouldn't undershoot it. But again, recognize that this is not multi-year funding, it's for 1 year. And I don't know the details of like all activities have to be within a year. I don't think that's true. But again, you'll need to get, more information from your representative, because at the end of the day, it's them. They're kind of like your surrogate. They're on the line for you, right? So there's a lot of public disclosure, a lot of auditing. And I think members of Congress, have their own layer of internal processes so that they're not building a bridge to nowhere. They're not going to have, negative political consequences for their community project funding. And new funding is not, new construction is not totally banned, but that would just be within HUD. It would have to be within the CDBG or those other allowable uses. You mentioned upcoming dates, yes. Yeah, I mean, if you can't make the short timeline work, I think no matter what, you should reach out to your House representative now. And because a lot of what I've been reading is it's kind of short, like it's like 100 character count or 500 word this, and then a budget with details. And then, maybe you have like 5 community partners that could get you a letter of support. You draft it for them, they put it on their letterhead and tweak it like within a week. I think we all kind of have those partners that can just, give you pretty quick turnaround on letters of support. And so I would see, how much the requirement is on the US House representative side, because you might have a lot of it already, just depending on what bucket. And I know Ship, you would be, I think, in the education bucket, right? I could be wrong, but I think if it's a partnership, that might be a little bit more challenging unless you already have like an existing partnership that you're looking to grow, across the region, across the district, have a bigger reach. So I think reach out. If it doesn't work for this deadline, it's a very short deadline, then you are on their radar for FY23. I mean, I think that this is going to continue, assuming FY22 doesn't have a bunch of political scandals, which it seems like it's really it's very mitigated for political scandal, then get on their radar for 2023. And again, this is the long game, right? And even if you do think, all the deadlines, you can meet those, and deadlines have been extended twice now. I don't know that they'll be extended again, but I think it's all the more reason to reach out, have the conversation, continue fostering that relationship. Maybe you could meet their deadlines, but you don't make the cut for the 10 this time. Be like, will you guarantee that I'll be in the 10 for 2023, right? And just keep building that community support, right? And just keep engaged, like we're always recommending. That's my thought. I think so someone asked, any thought on when decisions will be announced? I think you ask your representatives that you're speaking to when you will know, U.S. House Representative, when will I know if our community project funding request is one of the 10 that you are going to submit to the Appropriations Committee? That type of thing. Because it's kind of weird. It's kind of like your U.S. House Representative is like your funder, like a foundation. I mean, they're not, but it's kind of like that. Like, when will you know? Is there anything I could do to strengthen my proposal, right? Like, what would really help me get to be one of the 10, right? How could you tell me how likely it is that you would advance this request for FY 2022? And then, if you're not one of the 10, similar to like a foundation, when your grant application isn't successful, you want to try to get a meeting to learn what could have made my application stronger. What can I do to make sure it's one of the top 10 in 2023, right? I think you really need to think through, and have kind of a long game. No one knows when appropriations committees will make decisions. So there's no deadline except for, when the federal budget year ends, which is September 30th. And then, you would hope it would be passed and final by then. But there's definitely been it's very common to have a continuing resolution where they just kind of punt it another 3 months. So that's when I said, the appropriations process is the long game, right? Like, you want to be in there when they're first having conversations and drafting bills, because that's easier than an amendment later. But also there are moments where, when budget caps are raised or sequestration ended, and we still don't have President Biden's budget yet. So there's all sorts of kind of things in flux that could change. We don't know what the impacts of reconciliation are yet. Folks are kind of trying to figure that out. So there's a lot in play. But ideally, you would know by the end of this calendar year, right? I think ideally you would know by the end of this federal fiscal year, which, as I said, is September 30th, but that's not always the case. So again, it is a long game, but you do want to make sure, to the extent that you can and it's possible, that you are one of the top 10 proposals put forth and pushed by your House representatives. Hopefully I answered most everybody's questions. You can always email me after. member@nnforyouth.org comes to me as well. But thank you all so much. I hope this was helpful and got you thinking. Chat or email us if there's any other helpful information that we can provide in the future. It's been great to hang out with you for an hour and nerd out on all things policy, which I love. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your day. Bye, everyone.